I'm Jesse Nguyen.
And I'm Morgan Engelhardt.
And today we're going to be talking to you about DNA and its use in convicting criminals. The reason that DNA is used today by law enforcement agencies is because DNA is unique to every human being other than identical twins. So if your identical twin commits a crime, you might be in trouble. This allows it to be used for identification purposes if somebody leaves bodily tissue behind at a site. Specifically, DNA profiling is the process of finding a pattern of DNA for a human by testing bodily tissue. And that's demonstrated in the figure 1 over on the left here. Each of those lines is what they're testing for in the DNA, and they'll compare that to the sample taken from the suspect, and if they match up, there's a good chance that they are either related to the suspect or they are the suspect. And on the right here is what we've all seen in bio class, is a DNA double helix.
So here are a few pictures to kind of help you get the DNA profiling process down. First of all, for the process you need to have a sample of DNA. So that can be either blood smear, fingerprint, or much more such as hair, saliva, or skin cells. And down here, this picture here is what's called a PCR machine, or a thermal machine. And what it does is it makes millions of copies of the DNA sample. That way you have enough for the DNA profiling to actually go through. And then the other picture over here is the result of the DNA profiling. And it shows the variable number of tandem repeats. And what that means is that if these lines match up, you know that someone is related to someone else. And as you can see with this picture, is that the mom and the dad have completely different tandem lines, meaning that they're not related at all, whereas their first daughter has traces of both of their DNA, meaning that they're obviously related.
And that's all of our background, and now into the main argument. I'm arguing that DNA does help to convict more criminals. In a paper published by Newton Driscoll in 2014, DNA was found to have about a 1 in 260 billion chance of being a match with somebody if they're not actually the same person. So if the DNA is tested and there's a match to be found, there's only a 1 in 260 billion chance that it's actually somebody else's DNA. J.L. Peterson et al. In a study published in 2013 found a lot of evidence that really speaks to the efficacy of DNA in court. A case is more likely to reach court if DNA evidence is present, so charges are more likely to be filed, and you can't convict a criminal if you don't take them to court. He also found that DNA had a positive effect on a jury's decision to convict a criminal, and the solution of property crimes doubles when DNA evidence is just collected. It doesn't even need to be analyzed, but the fact that DNA evidence is there doubles the solution rate of property crimes. Gans also found, a study conducted by Gans in 2002 also found that you don't really need to examine much of the DNA in order to find a match. All you really need to do is search a very small percentage of it, because the rest of it is inactive DNA, to find matches. Peterson also found in his paper that DNA is highly effective for solving stranger rape cases. In cases where a boyfriend or a girlfriend accuses a boyfriend of rape, it's not effective, but if you collect DNA from the rape victim, it's much more likely to solve a stranger rape case. Driscoll in 2014, as stated in his paper, DNA degrades very slowly, so you can keep it for a long period of time and come back to it later if you need to reanalyze it, or if the court case is reopened, excuse me. So basically you can use it for profiling over a long period of time. He also found that it's more accurate even than fingerprinting, which is already a very good match. He also pointed out that all 50 states require convicted criminals of some sort, not all criminals, but some, mostly felons, to give their DNA to a database called CODIS, which keeps track of the DNA, so when they are released, if they commit another crime, it'll be much easier to connect them to that crime in the future. Databases such as these, he found, makes it a lot easier for cold cases to be revived, so a case that wasn't solved when it occurred but can be solved 5, 10, 15 years later. And he stated that thousands of cold cases have been brought back and solved by DNA. Rhonda Wheat found in 2010 that when DNA evidence is available for a case, the jurors are likely to say that the DNA evidence was very significant in the outcome of the case. So this was a survey of jurors that came right out and said, if there's DNA evidence, we will be much more convinced that there's been a crime committed. Again, in Peterson's 2013 paper, he found that the presence of forensic evidence makes a criminal charge more likely. Assault cases have a much better chance of conviction if there's DNA evidence present. It's actually not very unlikely that an assault case with no witnesses and no DNA evidence will be charged or the defendant convicted if there is no DNA evidence of the assault. When DNA is analyzed in a case and the defendant is convicted, the judge is more likely to give that person a longer sentence due to the presence of incriminating DNA evidence. So in summary, DNA matches should be considered statistically infallible. 1 in 260 billion is a drop in the ocean. The presence of DNA helps convince jurors of the guilt or innocence of the defendant. DNA can be used to find suspects from cold cases that were otherwise very unlikely to be solved. Criminals convicted based on DNA evidence get longer sentences on average, which keeps criminals off of the streets. And juries seem to expect DNA evidence. So, because of all of the crime shows that we're exposed to these days, juries might have an inflated view of what DNA can do, but the fact remains is they almost expect DNA evidence to be present in order to convict.
So, on the other hand, I'm going to be talking about the fact that DNA evidence does not help to convict more criminals, and it's for these three major reasons. There's flaws in DNA testing, there are a lot of innocent people that are later exonerated, and that it breaks citizens' rights. So the first one are the flaws in DNA testing, and as you can see there's quite a few. But the first one is that a DNA test can take up to 6 months to be complete, and in the timeline of a court case this can be too long sometimes, and they would have to go off of other evidence to convict someone before the DNA test was able to come back. Another flaw, as we talked about before, is that identical twins have the same DNA, where if their DNA is found at a crime scene, then both of them could be considered guilty, where only one person may have done it, or their DNA should not have just been there and was just there on accident. According to the Innocent People Project, DNA testing actually helps to free more innocent people rather than convict the guilty. And another fact is that it's very costly, and one DNA test can cost anywhere between $250 to $2,000, which is sometimes so expensive that the police decide that to not go forward and gather a DNA test depending on the crime. And another one is that a person's DNA can be anywhere depending on where they were before, such as like hair falling out and skin cells. Your DNA tends to leave a trace of where you were. So, another thing is that it exonerates the innocent people, and this is actually very common. And just within the United States, 325 people have been exonerated, which just means that they have been freed from blame, meaning that they were previously convicted guilty when they were actually not. And because of this could have been for many of reasons, such as the DNA test did not come back in time, or other evidence was gathered, which was later proven wrong. Because this is so common, laws in every state have actually been made where criminals are allowed to ask for a DNA test. And in Ohio, the law states that if an offender is eligible for exoneration, meaning there's any sort of uncertainty in their case, they are allowed to ask for a DNA test to try to be proven innocent. And how convicting someone that is innocent is done is that, as I said before, if a DNA test is too timely, they might use other types of evidence. And those can be such as confessions or eyewitnesses that may later be wrong. So my third and final point is that DNA testing violates human rights. And there's just a few questions to consider when thinking about this. And the first one is, at what point are the police allowed to take your DNA? Is it at arrest or just at a random search? And this has actually been thought about quite a lot, and each state has their own law. However, 28 states in the United States decided that DNA was allowed to be collected from a criminal at their arrest, if it is necessary. Another question is, how long can the police keep your DNA on file after an arrest or after conviction? And again, each state has their own law. However, a lot of people don't agree with each state's law. Another question is, can your DNA be matched to another case that you may be a potential suspect for, the police may believe that you are? And as of right now, the answer to this is no, because when the police take your DNA, they are required to tell you what it's going to be tested for, where it's going, just because it's your rights. And if they break those rights, it's actually breaking that law. And the final question is, can they take your DNA from not just a direct person, but other places such as hairbrush or garbage cans? And there's different laws to this, but as of right now, they would need a warrant. But in very serious crime scenes, the warrant would obviously be given. So just a few statistics within the United States alone is that 20 people have actually been sentenced to death before they could be proven innocent, meaning they were wrongly convicted in the first place due to either the DNA test not coming back in enough time that they used other evidence, or the other evidence was wrong, or the DNA test was not correct. Another statistic is that on average, wrongly convicted people serve up to 13.6 years in jail, which is an extremely long amount of time for someone who did not actually commit the crime to be in prison. And the third statistic is that in 38 states, including Washington, D.C., an exoneration case has been made, which just shows how widespread the convicting an innocent person actually is. So in conclusion, I believe that DNA testing does not help to convict more criminals, although it's ultimately up to you guys to decide. Thank you.
Thank you.